All right, let's get started. Hello, everybody. I'm Bill Fulton, the director of the Kinder Institute here at Rice University. And I want to say welcome to all of you to the Kinder Institute Urban Reads series, which showcases recently published books on cities and urban issues published by, written by regional and national authors. And today, we're going to hear from Elizabeth Korver-Glenn, author of Race Brokers and a former Rice University PhD student in sociology. We ask that you tweet using hashtag KIUrbanReads. That's hashtag KIUrbanReads. I think you saw that before. You can follow us at Rice on Twitter at RiceKinder INST, RiceKinder Inst. The Urban Read series is made possible thanks to our friends at Centerpoint Energy, the title sponsor of the lecture series, and I'd be happy to welcome Alicia Dixon from Centerpoint to give a few brief remarks. Alicia, thank you for being here today.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much, Bill. My name is Alicia Dixon, and Centerpoint Energy is honored to be the title sponsor of the Kinder Institute Urban Reads series, and today's event featuring author Elizabeth Korver-Glenn. As Bill mentioned, this series features recently published authors and writing about urban issues that are critical and important to today's society. And just as a quick reminder of who we are, Centerpoint Energy is an energy delivery company. We're bigger than Houston, Texas. We are headquartered here in Houston, but we actually serve more than 7 million electric and natural gas customers in 8 states. So our service territory goes all the way from the Gulf Coast to the Great Lakes. And today's topic, which examines how housing market professionals construct current urban market in ways that contribute to neighborhood inequality and racial segregation, is actually very, very relevant to us at Centerpoint Energy, because we certainly recognize that our success and the success of our neighbors is linked explicitly, very much linked to the vibrancy of our neighborhoods and the communities that we serve. We simply exist because of our customers. So to that end, the Centerpoint Energy Foundation strives to be a catalyst. We invest in initiatives that not only improve customers' lives today, but also hopefully build a foundation for a better tomorrow. So our giving focuses on ensuring high quality of life in the communities that we serve. And we seek to improve the areas we serve by sponsoring and supporting and investing in programs that encourage connections, improve quality of life, and promote inclusion to help the communities thrive. We strengthen communities by investing primarily in 2 areas: community vitality and education. Quickly, community vitality focuses on affordable housing initiatives, contributing to quality of place, and ensuring our community. Education focuses on improving literacy rates, expanding access to STEM programs, and workforce development. And within these focus areas, we look for programs that serve under-resourced populations, seek to advance equity, and promote inclusion to help our communities thrive. So I'm really looking forward to today's lecture, and on behalf of Centerpoint Energy, thank you and welcome. We hope you enjoy the presentation.
Thank you, Alicia. Generous support, in addition to Centerpoint, which is our title sponsor for the lecture series, generous support for the Kinder Institute comes from a multi-year grant from Houston Endowment, and we rely on the philanthropic investments of many other contributors. Special thanks go to Nancy and Rich Kinder and the Kinder Foundation, Laura and Tom Bacon, the Baxter Trust, the Hewlett Foundation, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, the William T. Grant Foundation, Chevron, the J.P. Morgan Chase Foundation, Wells Fargo, Willie Nanayakara and Associates, the Cullen Foundation, Raynette and Stan Merrick, the Spencer Foundation, PNC Bank, Claire and Eric Anya, Arnold Ventures, Catherine and Hank Coleman, Sis and Hasty Johnson, Becky and Ralph O'Connor, Bank of America, Bracewell, HEB, and the United Way of Greater Houston. So thanks to all of those donors and contributors to help make everything we do possible. Let me introduce now Elizabeth Korver-Glenn. She's an assistant professor of sociology at the University of New Mexico. Her award-winning research has been published in American Sociological Review, Social Problems, Social Currents, Sociology of Race and Ethnicity, and City and Community, among other peer-reviewed outlets. Her work has also been featured in national news outlets, including the Washington Post. Elizabeth is also a proud graduate of the PhD program in sociology at Rice University. And the basic work of Race Brokers really was focused on her field research here in Houston. So, and as Elizabeth and I were talking about before, this book has received a great deal more attention than the typical academic book. And we're very proud at Rice of Elizabeth and everything she's been accomplishing, and can't wait to hear her presentation today. So I'm going to turn it over to Elizabeth to make a presentation. At the end, I'll come back and we'll do a Q&A session with Elizabeth, with your questions in the Q&A box. So Elizabeth, I'll hand it over to you.
Great. Thank you, Bill. I want to check to make sure everyone can see my screen. Awesome. So thank you to the Kinder Institute and its sponsors for inviting me to be a part of this year's Urban Read series. I'm really excited to engage and think about my work with you all today, and I'm really looking forward to a lively and constructive Q&A at the end. So in the fall of 2012, my spouse and I purchased our first home, a small bungalow in one of urban Houston's historic barrios. The experience was bewildering and overwhelming. It entailed multiple meetings with real estate agents, trying to find a mortgage lender to get an FHA loan, getting confusing counsel from a real estate agent, trying to explain what a short sale was, filling out all manner of paperwork, waiting for an appraisal, getting bids from subcontractors who could help us with replacing floors, and awaiting the results of a full inspection. And among other things, this 3-month process impressed on me the complexity and the sheer number of interactions with various types of people and actors necessary for buying a house. Around the same time, I began to realize that prior research on contemporary racial residential segregation had one of two foci. First, it focused on top-down or structural inequalities. These included federal policies and big picture socioeconomic inequalities across racial groups. Or second, segregation research focused on individuals' prejudices or experiences of discrimination. But it missed how powerful gatekeeping actors and industries brought racist prejudice, discrimination, and inequality together across stages of interaction in the actual day-to-day functioning of the housing market. So I became convinced that to better understand persistent housing inequality and residential segregation, it was imperative to parse housing exchange as a social process that was deeply influenced by housing market industries and professionals. That is, it was key to examine how real estate professionals and industries influence interactions and transactions, and how racism mattered for their influence. Moreover, previous research on and theorization of contemporary racial segregation largely assumed that the housing market and real estate industries were basically race neutral in the post-Fair Housing Act era. But this assumption did not make sense to me, given the obvious and overtly racist institutional and organizational policies and practices of the US housing market from the 1930s onward, and what we know about the persistence of racism in other spheres, such as the criminal justice system. So I set out to illuminate the specific ways that the contemporary US housing market remains racialized. So in my book, I address these two kind of major gaps in racial segregation research by asking and answering several research questions, 3 of which I'll highlight today. So the first one is, how and why do real estate professionals and industries connect racism to housing market activities? Second, how are contemporary real estate industries and organizations racialized? And thirdly, are there alternatives to these racialized market realities? And if so, what are their implications? So in order to be able to answer these questions, I conducted more than 100 in-depth interviews with real estate agents, housing developers, mortgage lenders, appraisers, home buyers and sellers, and others in Houston, Texas, between 2015 and 2016. I also conducted 1 year of ethnographic fieldwork with 13 different real estate agents and housing developers in Houston. And all of this fieldwork resulted in 200 unique interactions with real estate professionals. And many of these professionals I interacted with multiple times. So we're talking hundreds of interactions across a year's time. I also conducted some archival and spatial analyses that we'll get brought a little bit into in this particular talk. I'm happy to answer more questions about that. And I also want to note that I was able to gather a lot of this data in part because I was working with a lot of white real estate agents, developers, mortgage lenders, and appraisers. And in many cases, they seem to assume that they could share their actual thoughts and feelings and practices with me because I am also a white identified person. And I'm happy to talk more about my positionality and its relationship to the fieldwork and data collection in the Q&A as well. So turning to the findings, what are some of the answers to the questions that I asked? So first, regardless of profession, whether developers, real estate agents, lenders, or appraisers, white professionals shared racist stereotypes about groups and neighborhoods of color and positive views about their white counterparts. These stereotypes largely conform to what prior research on racial ideologies and stereotyping has shown. So for instance, white informants and respondents perceived Asian individuals as high status, but also difficult to work with. Additionally, these white individuals perceived Black people as poor, financially irresponsible, or dangerous. These professionals also perceived Latino, Mexican, or Hispanic people as being low income or working class and lacking understanding about American banking systems. And they overwhelmingly associated white people with wealth, financial savvy, and responsibility, and high education. Then professionals used this racist market, what I call this racist market rubric, this evaluative schema, to conduct their housing market activities. They were what I call racism brokers. By contrast, and much more rarely, professionals of color and a very small number of white professionals across real estate industries, with the exception of appraising, and I'll talk about that more later, viewed whites as the best off economically and often held positive views about people and places of color. For instance, they viewed Latinx individuals as hardworking and Black individuals as tenacious or persistent. They viewed all groups, especially those of color, as deserving of their time and attention, and they used this people-oriented market rubric to prioritize Black and Latinx people and places in their work. Okay, so white professionals used racism to do their everyday work. They did so in myriad ways as a matter of routine. This happened repeatedly, and you'll see some of this throughout the lecture. And some professionals of color rejected such racism and pursued people-oriented visions of people and places. But why do white professionals pursue racism in such routine ways? And why are there so few people-oriented professionals? To answer this question, I'll turn to discussing the contemporary racialization of the housing market and its industries. So in short, the reason why is that contemporary real estate industries are fundamentally racialized. Fair housing legislation did not prompt meaningful changes in the ways contemporary real estate industries are organized or in how they operate, which is to say that each real estate industry is shot through with formal and informal rules, routines, policies, and practices that depend on and reproduce individual and neighborhood racial hierarchies. Specifically, they preserve white status and hypervaluation precisely by devaluing, excluding, and denigrating Asian, Black, and Latinx people and places, and especially hinge on anti-Blackness. But why do white housing market professionals trot out racism so often? Because this is how the American housing market is supposed to function, and real estate industries and organizations incentivize maintaining the status quo. People-oriented professionals of color were fighting an up-mountain battle to go not only against the broader racialized social system, but also against the very specific industry and organizational mechanisms that reward maintaining that system in the housing sphere. So while my book shows at least two major mechanisms of housing market racialization within each industry, today I'll highlight just one from each industry to provide an overview. So beginning with the housing development industry, I found that broadly speaking, housing developers working in urban areas began their decision-making process about where to build at the neighborhood level. They used racist interpretations of neighborhoods and neighborhood reputation to select the areas they believed would be the most profitable. They assumed that white neighborhoods or perhaps Latinx areas near white areas were the most desirable and would be the most desirable to white home buyers and would therefore be the most economically profitable. They thus focused their attention on these areas, buying land and building or renovating homes, as well as building up local infrastructure and beefing up local home values. Once they made this general neighborhood level where to build decision, they had to find specific plots of land to build on. At this point, they engaged in what I and others call reverse blockbusting. Whether by contacting specific homeowners in person or via mailers, or placing signs advertising home purchasing services, developers relied on racist ideas about Latinx and Black homeowners as gullible or as having little knowledge about housing market dynamics. They did so because they believed they could purchase these homes for bargain prices, particularly in areas they believed whites were increasingly buying. Their aim was to purchase low, develop the land for white consumption, and sell high. So reverse blockbusting is a close cousin to what is now known as blockbusting, a now illegal practice real estate agents used in early and mid 20th century American cities. And in contrast to this practice from decades past, housing developers in my study targeted homeowners of color, reversing the flow of targeting and property turnover. Developers in my study did not bank on homeowners' racist fears, as did their real estate agent counterparts in the era before the Fair Housing Act. Rather, they assumed these homeowners would be the least likely to understand housing market dynamics and would be the most likely to be in a precarious economic position that would motivate them to sell their homes at below market price. What blockbusting and reverse blockbusting have in common is that they rely on racist ideas that relegate individuals of color to the lowest rungs of the social hierarchy and do so in order to extract wealth. So Brad, a white housing developer, targeted Latinx homeowners in white areas around urban Houston to find homes at bargain prices that he could tear down to make room for new development. When I asked Brad about why Latinx individuals were moving out of the Heights neighborhood, he explained, because they get it bought out, right? I mean, I buy houses every day from Hispanics. They move somewhere else, we take their property, destroy it, and build a house for a rich white family to move in. When I asked him where he thought the Latinx families moved, he first said he did not know, but then he guessed they moved to Katy, Texas. He then rationalized the strategy of targeting Latinx homeowners for land acquisition by positing that these families had made good money and could move to the suburbs. He said, they'll just move out to the suburbs or Katy. I mean, they make good money. Usually their properties are paid for and they make $300,000 to $400,000 to go buy a really nice house in Katy, so they can get out of their 2-bedroom bath bungalow that's falling down. Apparently, it did not occur to Brad, who was also active as a licensed real estate agent and had at least one real estate agent working for him, to go on to represent these Latinx families when they purchased these ostensible $300,000 to $400,000 homes in Houston suburbs. Developers' choices, including those regarding reverse blockbusting, were about maintaining a racial economic order and not just maximizing economic efficiency. In addition to contacting Latinx homeowners in person, like Brad did, developers sometimes made contact by mailing letters and flyers advertising specific services to homeowners in areas they were targeting. Mateo, for example, kept this form letter in his files. In addition to providing details about 2 options for selling the home, the letter reflected Mateo's desire to build a sense of shared purpose with prospective Latinx sellers, which he emphasized by including his name and personal cell phone number at the bottom of the letter. Others involved in the process, other involved stakeholders, understood and influenced reverse blockbusting among housing developers. For instance, in August of 2015, I attended a meeting between Casey, a Black developer and farmer working in a predominantly Black Houston neighborhood, and Rob, a white planning consultant. During the meeting held at Casey's office, Rob repeatedly emphasized Casey's need for a better, more concrete plan to acquire land for housing development moving forward. His advice was to use Casey's local knowledge of the neighborhood to, quote, hold on to land, target particular areas before speculation by other developers happens, end quote. At the same time, he recommended bringing in an outside consultant who would help implement this plan, moving forward and acquiring land from a list of specific properties they had already compiled. It was important to hire this outside person soon, he said, because, quote, we need to get that land now so that we can sell it privately at a nice profit. We need someone to do the plan that isn't tied to race, class, socioeconomic status, baggage, end quote. In other words, Rob was proposing that because of his and Casey's local ties, specifically the, quote, baggage of their interracial, intraracial, and interclass dynamics and relationships, none of those present in the room could themselves target the Black homeowners on the list. Instead, an outside person would be better positioned to take what he viewed as a necessary step in making development profitable, acquiring property at a low price in order to sell high, exploiting Black homeowners in the process. Once homes are built, they are sold, almost always through a real estate brokerage and the involvement of at least one real estate agent. The real estate brokerage industry and organizations racialize the exchange process in myriad ways, including incentivizing real estate agents to cultivate what I call networks of value to find clients. This means they pressured agents to find clients through their social networks, which for white agents are predominantly, usually almost exclusively white, and associate their pay with a percentage-based commission, encouraging white agents to presume prospective clients' social, moral, cultural, and economic worth in their attempts to drum up business. These presumptions draw from widely shared racist stereotypes about people of color and the racist appraisal system, which imposes a racial economic hierarchy on neighborhoods, and I'll talk more about that later. But just as organizational pressures shape agents' networking strategies, organizational pressures influence listing agents' marketing practices. And one of these pressures is real estate boards' market area maps, which exist in urban areas across the US. In Houston, it is the Houston Association of Realtors Market Area Map, and I'm guessing many of you are probably familiar with that map. This map reinforces a spatial hierarchy of race and sets majority white areas apart as unique or special. So here it is. I'm guessing this is a familiar map to many of you, but during my research, so when I conducted the research in 2015 and 2016, there were 98 HAR market areas that were within or that overlapped the city of Houston boundaries. Overall, the area encompassed by these 98 market areas was 20% Black, 41% Latinx, and 31% white. And unsurprisingly, given the long history of racial segregation, 70 of these market areas were predominantly one race, majority Black, majority Latinx, or majority white. But if these 70 majority race market areas were divvied up in ways that actually represented the Black, Latinx, and white proportions for the entire area, we would expect to see 14 majority Black, 29 majority Latinx, and 21 majority white market areas. But this was not the case. Rather, there were 50 majority white market areas, which was 2.4 times more than expected. These areas had about 20,000 residents on average. By contrast, there were only 4 majority Black and 14 majority Latinx market areas, 1.8 and 3.5 times less than expected. These areas also had much larger numbers of residents. The extreme overrepresentation of majority white and underrepresentation of majority Black and majority Latinx market areas, as well as vast differences in population size across these market areas, indicates greater marketing specialization for white areas, even relative to high income characteristics. These market areas hide income and other forms of diversity in Black and Latinx areas, but amplify the uniquenesses of white areas. By requiring and automating for sale homes assignment to its market areas, the Houston Association of Realtors ensures homes were advertised in a spatially and racially unequal manner. So once homes are listed for sale and a prospective buyer makes an offer, the buyer usually must then seek out a mortgage loan to finance the sale. And a lot of research, including my own, has illuminated mortgage bankers' racist evaluations of borrowers. In my book, I also show how bankers similarly enact racist evaluations of properties and neighborhoods when they are assessing loan risk. But how do mortgage bankers find their clients? I found that mortgage bankers tended to prioritize networking with real estate agents to find mortgage borrowers, a practice that is encouraged by the broader mortgage lending industry. So unlike what this photo perhaps suggests, mortgage bankers do not simply wait for prospective home buyers and borrowers to come to them. They actively build connections with real estate agents in order to access borrowers, reasoning that successful networking with one real estate agent will be more fruitful than trying to network with many dozens of potential home buyers. So mortgage bankers viewed real estate agents as crucial to expanding their loan applicant portfolios, and real estate agents viewed relationships with mortgage bankers as an important service they offered their clients. But most white mortgage bankers and real estate agents took this inter-industry networking and made it exclusionary, avoiding professionals of color and pursuing connections with white real estate agents and mortgage bankers, respectively. They assumed that doing so would return higher yields. Such segregated inter-industry networking was remarkably similar to how white real estate agents cultivated networks of value among housing consumers. Segregated inter-industry networking resulted in racially segregated professional and client networks for mortgage bankers and jump-started mortgage inequality before borrowers ever encountered loan officers or loan products. For instance, during my fieldwork, I observed Cole and Brandon, two white mortgage bankers, actively pursuing relationships with white real estate agents and housing developers. Cole, for example, attended a client appreciation event that white real estate agent Michael hosted for approximately 50 of his consumer clients and professional acquaintances, including other agents, developers, and mortgage bankers, almost all of whom were white. Cole worked the crowd, rekindling connections with people he had met previously and introducing himself to other professionals and consumers he did not know. At a separate event, a broker open house that Michael hosted, Brandon attended and networked with Michael and several other white real estate agents present. There were no real estate agents of color. Brandon also attended a public open house hosted by Jane, another white real estate agent. As he introduced himself to her and advertised his mortgage services, Brandon made sure to give Jane a firm handshake and a business card. Throughout my year of fieldwork, I never observed any of the white real estate agent informants in my study refer a home buying client of any race or ethnicity to a mortgage banker of color. Later, I interviewed Brandon, and he explained the racist underpinnings of his segregated inter-industry networking this way. He said, I see a lot of instances that African Americans that are applying for a mortgage, that more often than anything else, than any other race, I believe there's more, a term that we use, a little bit more hair on the deal, like credit, right, when they're trying to reach more for their property, as well as the fact that they're just not as familiar with it. That is, Brandon believed that Black mortgage borrowers were more likely to have problematic loan applications, whether because they had low credit or trying to purchase a home outside of their means, or were unfamiliar with the mortgage process. These beliefs functioned as red flags for Brandon, such that he became suspicious of borrowers' credit risk once he knew they were Black. And as a result, he did not network with Black real estate agents or clients, but rather prioritized white agents and buyers, as I discovered in my fieldwork. So what about appraising? One of the final and very important steps of closing a home sale. In my book, I discuss the logic and methods of the appraisal industry, both historic and contemporary. And today I'll highlight the racialized logic undergirding the main residential appraisal method, still used today, the sales comparison approach. Although specific aspects of the sales comparison approach have changed with the passage of fair housing legislation, appraisers have been using the same general technique for almost as long as banks have offered mortgages. So how did and how do appraisers assess home value, and why? So before 1968, federal and industry rules explicitly required appraisers to assess individual home values by comparing each for-sale home to other previously sold homes located within the same neighborhood or in other neighborhoods with similar race and class profiles. These rules primed appraisers to use white homeowners and buyers' racial prejudices as the standard for determining home and neighborhood desirability. This practice, now known in part as redlining, ensured that neighborhoods of color were rated as undesirable and too risky for mortgage loans, and that white neighborhoods, especially those that were higher income, were rated as the most desirable. Individual home values were based on neighborhood racial rankings. A combination of fair housing legislation and lawsuits against the appraisal industry resulted in these explicit rules being removed from appraisal forms and training materials. But fair housing legislation, including the passage of the Community Reinvestment Act of 1977, did nothing to address how prior appraisals conducted under the explicitly racist redlining system continued to be used before and after 1977. Homes appraised in 1978, for instance, still drew on comparable sales data from, say, 1977 or even 1976, in which the explicitly racist criteria of appraising were still in effect in many places across the nation. Moreover, formal and informal appraisal training materials still used today encourage appraisers to evaluate individual homes through the surrounding area's neighborhood racial composition. In the most recent iteration of the Appraisal of Real Estate handbook, the Appraisal Institute states that neighborhood boundaries, quote, may coincide with observable changes in land use or demographic characteristics, end quote. Further, it directs appraisers to draw preliminary neighborhood boundaries because, quote, the boundaries of market areas, neighborhoods, and districts identify the areas that influence a subject property's value. Then the handbook instructs appraisers to check their preliminary boundaries against the demographic characteristics of those who live inside those boundaries. Through this training, the Appraisal Institute reinforces the idea that social difference is between neighborhoods, not within them. Moreover, the Appraisal Institute states that, quote, focusing on the demographic characteristics that tend to influence property values most in the community is a necessary aspect of the appraisal process. So by encouraging its appraisers to focus on the neighborhood's demographic characteristics, as well as the supposed desirability of neighborhoods and determining their, quote, comparability, appraisal organizations such as the Appraisal Institute prime individual appraisers to take race into account. Even if it's not officially recorded on an appraisal form, race and racist ideas about place influence appraisers' assessment. So one Houston area appraiser illustrated this by saying, quote, well, what we do is we appraise the whole component. So, you know, Montrose is where everyone wants to be. It's close to the schools, it's close to downtown, the medical center, and all the recreation stuff. So the builder down there can charge a $300,000 premium because that's where everyone wants to live. And then up here, north of Montrose, it's getting better because of all the Mexican people moving out. So again, once you start jumping freeways and going to other neighborhoods, you're going to have a subjective adjustment of what's the land value and the demand or the appeal of that neighborhood there. The racialized logic of neighborhood desirability and comparability or incomparability then influenced how Allen selected comps and ultimately the values he assigned to individual homes. Or in another example, consider these photos from two urban Houston neighborhoods with similar quality housing stock, location centrality, crime, neighborhood association activity, and so on. One neighborhood, the Heights, is white, and the other neighborhood, Lindale Park, is Latinx. These neighborhoods practically border each other. Yet consider white appraiser Fred's assessments of how he perceives these neighborhoods. He said, quote, as an appraiser, we run into stuff as far as racial stuff. The Heights has always been great because it's the Heights. It's like, oh, I'm living in West U. You know, in Lindale Park, it's like, I'm over there in the ghetto. It's kind of scary because if I go by to appraise a house over there, I'm kind of looking around. As for the Heights, I'm driving right up to the house. I have no worries. Appraisers understand and are professionalized to understand white neighborhoods as the most appealing and desirable, and neighborhoods of color as undesirable. White neighborhoods and neighborhoods of color were not comparable and are not comparable to appraisers around the country. Consequently, determinations of neighborhood comparability or lack thereof influenced appraisers' assessments of individual home value. These actions are enormously consequential. They mean that in addition to the explicitly racist redlining continuing to indirectly influence contemporary home values, contemporary appraisals continue to bake racist ideas into the valuation process. With my colleague, Dr. Junia Howell, I examined home value changes across the 107 largest cities in the US from 1980 to 2015. We found that when comparing similar homes in socioeconomically similar neighborhoods with similar real estate demand, neighborhood racial composition was a stronger predictor of home values in 2015 than it was in 1980. In fact, between 1980 and 2015, homes in white neighborhoods appreciated $194,000 more than the same homes located in otherwise similar Black and Latinx neighborhoods. Our findings indicate that redlining may be officially over, but in reality, appraisers continue to use racist ideas about neighborhoods to assess desirability and appeal, and ultimately home values. So, against the strong current of the racialized housing market swam a few housing developers, real estate agents, and mortgage bankers of color who adopted the alternate people-oriented rubric that guided their real estate practices. In May 2015, Pablo, a Latino housing developer, showed me around a couple of new homes he was building in an urban Houston neighborhood of color. As we walked up the stairs of a home still under construction, he described how he decided where to build. He said, our strategy has always been where there's land and strong community and to work with the neighborhood. We buy empty land and we don't knock on people's doors because I think that's disrespectful. We noticed that between here and Camden Street, it seemed like more of a neighborhood feel, and the neighborhood is welcoming. Pablo's approach was distinctly counter to the pervasive reverse blockbusting practiced by many of his developer peers. Real estate agents also sometimes went against industry and organizational racialized norms and policies. For instance, Candace, a middle-aged Black real estate agent active in Fifth Ward and other areas of metropolitan Houston, often rejected the percentage-based commission component of real estate brokerage, a key mechanism underlying racist networking strategies. Candace regularly departed from the standard 6% commission model adopted by almost all of her peers. Unlike some other real estate agents of color, Candace explained this flexibility in terms of her desire to assist her clients as people she knew would otherwise be marginalized or excluded because of her real estate agent counterparts' racist ideas. During her interview held at her brokerage in suburban Houston, she explained, if I've known you for years, I might say, I'll sell it for $1. It depends on the rapport you have. And then each case is case by case, but we don't have a set rate. Everybody here charges 6%, of course. Sometimes I may go 4%, 5%. If I have a buyer that's marginal, I'll give in. We're not supposed to, but I do because I'm a social worker at heart. I want people to get into their homes. I want to put a family into a home. So sometimes I have to bite the bullet. Candace and other real estate agents of color intentionally networked with consumers of color because they perceive these buyers and sellers as economically, culturally, and symbolically valuable. Although agents of color often viewed white consumers as high value, their shared experiences and awareness of housing market exclusion and discrimination also shaped how they understood value and finessed their networks. Likewise, mortgage bankers and real estate agents of color at times rejected the segregated inter-industry networking strategies of their white counterparts. They networked with a racially diverse set of professionals in attempts to build a racially diverse clientele. For instance, I observed Tony, a Mexican-American housing developer and real estate agent during my year of field work. Tony had been actually forbidden from working with a specific white architect. This white architect would not work with Tony during my field work. Tony took the high road. He said one day at his office, he invited a Black mortgage banker, Jake, and Black real estate agent, Shauna, to cast their vision for working together. Tony's welcome of and networking with these other professionals was in stark contrast with other white real estate agents like Jane, the white agent I mentioned earlier, who actually rebuffed attempts by a mortgage banker of color to network with her. And Jane actually reported this mortgage banker to the president of a mortgage lending company because she didn't want her to network with her. But approaches like Tony's, Candace's, and Pablo's were very rare, and only a few professionals, almost all of color, adopted them. So, among other takeaways, in my book, I discussed that the usual explanations for persistent racial residential segregation are inadequate because they ignore the fundamental racialization of the contemporary housing market. That is, it's not just a matter of a few bad apples in the barrel. This is the way that the housing market functions. And understanding that is crucial for understanding persistent housing inequalities and racial segregation. I also discuss a lot about how racial segregation is a racialized process, and it's mediated by organizational and individual gatekeepers, right? Real estate industries and real estate professionals have immense power in the housing market, and they matter a great deal for how we understand these persistent inequalities. I also discuss how some racism breakers worked against the racialized process, but there are limits to what they can do to mitigate racism-produced segregation as long as the racialized foundations of a commodified housing market persist. So what can be done about the contemporary racialized housing market? In my book, I offer 3 sets of policy interventions: monitoring, litigating, and intervening. For instance, housing developers remain almost completely unmonitored when it comes to social inequality. There is no standardized professional licensure and no way to track what developers are doing, why they are doing it, or what the consequences of their actions are. To be able to penalize racialized practices such as reverse blockbusting, we have to first monitor developers. With respect to litigating, I offer much evidence that can support fair housing advocates and lawyers' efforts to sue people and companies for housing discrimination and find creative ways to present evidence for such discrimination. And finally, I offer a number of concrete suggestions for direct intervention in the housing market, including outlawing organizational practices such as market area maps and abandoning the sales comparison approach to appraising and pursuing redistributive justice for the decades of its use that have hypervalued white communities and undervalued communities of color. Racial segregation doesn't produce hyper-surveillance and criminalization of people and places of color. It doesn't produce elevated educational quality in white neighborhoods for white children. It doesn't cause more amenities in white neighborhoods and fewer lower quality ones in neighborhoods of color. People use segregation as a tool to cause these injustices. And people with great power in the housing market and the industries they animate cause racial segregation through entwining racism with market functioning. Indeed, if some of the alternate people-oriented practices used by professionals of color in my study were adopted more broadly, the housing market would cease to function in its current form. And maybe that should be the point. Thank you.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Pretty powerful. I'm sorry. I'm getting my video back on. Pretty powerful and compelling. Thanks very much for that. We'll move to questions and answers now. There are some questions lining up in the Q&A. Again, if you have a question, put it in the Q&A. If you like a question, please highlight it so that it'll move up the list. I want to get to the questions from the audience in a minute, but Elizabeth, I want to ask you, you mentioned the policy interventions at the end, but I wanted to ask you, it certainly seems to me, based on your research, that this country has failed in its ability to implement successfully the Fair Housing Act of 1968. And I'm just kind of wondering, from your point of view, why do you think that is? Was that law not strong enough? Was it not well enough enforced? Were these processes too deeply embedded for that to make any difference? Or did it make some difference, but not enough?
Thank you for that question, Bill. I first of all want to say, I think that the Fair Housing Act and related fair housing legislation like the Community Reinvestment Act has absolutely made a difference. And I've talked to many fair housing lawyers over the last several years, and many of them have explained to me the ways that they've been able to use that legislation to successfully sue corporations and people who have violated those acts and have committed various forms of housing discrimination, including by class categories such as disability, race, and so on. At the same time, I also think what my research suggests is that the Fair Housing Act, it helps with the kind of the litigation of overt forms of discrimination. So like somebody says like a racist epithet and that the person that they're saying it about hears them, okay? Yes, that can absolutely be prosecuted. Or another way that fair housing legislation has helped is disparate impact, right? If you can prove that a specific policy has had a disparate impact on a protected class, then you might be able to win a suit in court. But what the Fair Housing Act did not do, related legislation didn't do, is that it did not change or alter the fundamental underpinnings of how business gets done. So for instance, the Fair Housing Act didn't address how it is that real estate agents go about garnering business. Like how do real estate agents drum up business? They do it through their social networks. And they do it specifically through combining their social networks with this percentage-based commission, which is not ever formally stated, at least publicly, but is a standard. I mean, every single real estate agent I talked to said, well, no, we don't just write it down and we're flexible, but every single one of them, with the exception of a very small number, said, we use the 6% rule, right? We use 6%. And then they use that to determine like who it is that they're trying to network with, right? The Fair Housing Act did nothing to change or alter the logic or methods of the appraisal industry. The sales comparison approach is virtually unchanged. Besides deleting a few of the explicitly racial kind of categories from its official forms, the sales comparison approach is still virtually the same today as it was almost 100 years ago. And nothing about the fair housing legislation that we've seen passed actually corrected for the decades of injustice that the explicitly racist policies and rules created. So I'll say it's a both and, right? The Fair Housing Act and related legislation gave us some tools, and they gave lawyers some tools to be able to prosecute housing discrimination. But the Fair Housing Act and related legislation were also very contested in their passage, and they did not actually do much to fundamentally alter how housing exchange happens or how real estate industry work happens. And that work is still today is fundamentally racialized as a result.
Okay, thank you. Let's move on to questions from the audience now, and there are quite a few. The most popular questions revolve around, I'm going to paraphrase, they revolve around a couple of different themes. One of the themes is the National Association of Realtors or any other real estate association attempting to deal with this racism in the real estate markets? Is there an effort to do that, or is that something they simply don't pay attention to at all?
Yes, so there is some movement amongst industries. So one of the things I didn't get a chance to talk about today, but I know that the National Association of Realtors has taken up, is the issue of pocket listings. And for those who are not familiar, pocket listings are home sale listings that real estate agents keep in their pocket. Like they don't actually list them publicly on the MLS or on HAR in the Houston context. They just distribute them privately to their networks. And so as you can imagine, as the research I just reported discussed, white real estate agents have almost exclusively white networks. And so if they're just passing information about homes that are for sale to their networks, that means they are disproportionately excluding home buyers of color from even knowing that those houses are for sale. So I believe it was in 2019, the National Association of Realtors passed what was called the Clear Cooperation Rule, which basically said, yeah, don't do that anymore. Don't engage pocket listings. However, my understanding is that there are no meaningful enforcement mechanisms for that rule, and I don't actually know to what extent the NAR is actually doing anything about it. Another industry where we've seen some movement is definitely the appraisal industry. So as a result of some of my research and some of the research I've done with Dr. Junia Howell, we've given multiple presentations and talks to folks like the Appraisal Institute, to the Federal Housing Finance Agency, Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, and we have alerted them about these dynamics. And actually, Freddie Mac, just maybe 2 weeks ago or so, published a report that used almost 13 million appraisals conducted between 2015 and 2020, and it showed dramatic racial inequality at both the neighborhood and the individual level and how appraisals are conducted. And it basically validated all of the research we have been doing, but using Freddie Mac's own data. So the appraisal industry is definitely kind of coming under the gun. So yes, we do see some industry movement, although I'll say with regards to real estate brokerage and housing development, I see almost nothing so far. Real estate brokerage, I see some, but it doesn't seem to have a lot of meaningful kind of enforcement mechanisms, or at least we're not able to see what the effect of that kind of rule is, because we don't have any access to any kind of data that allows to see what will happen as a result.
I'm going to paraphrase a couple of questions here, one from Cara Baez and one from Abigail Brown. We've talked a lot about the industry as a whole. You talked about the Federal Fair Housing Act. Are there things that can be done at the local level, either by municipalities or other influencers at the local level, to change these practices and reduce the inherent racism you identify? Or is it necessarily a national problem?
Yes, I do think there are some things that can be done locally, although I will say, to address the magnitude of the issue, I think that eventually the federal government is going to have to put some weight into it. But I think locally, for instance, I know that after I presented my research on pocket listings to Redfin, this is a couple of years ago now, Redfin essentially banned pocket listings. So their agents are no longer allowed to use or engage pocket listings. So individual brokerages could implement rules like, no, even though regardless of what NAR says, we are not going to allow pocket listings. Another thing that I think really needs to be discussed, and I know that this is touchy for real estate agents, I've talked to so many of them over the years, is to really think about what it means to be on a percentage-based commission, and to be very open about what it means to have a percentage-based commission when you have not only the history of unequal home values across neighborhoods of different races, but you have the contemporary appraisal industry who is making those differences worse. So what does it mean to pin a real estate agent's pay on those inequities? And so what is it, what are creative ways to rethink how real estate agents get paid that don't pin their pay and their wages to a system that's already just racialized, in addition to the fact that many white agents themselves bring those racist stereotypes to the table when they're pursuing clients. I have yet to find a brokerage that's willing to talk openly with me about like percentage-based commission, but I think it's really necessary. I think it's one of the linchpins. Another thing I think municipalities can do is actually begin to monitor for-profit housing developers. There is some monitoring that happens of developers that use public funds. And so for instance, in 2015, there was actually like a successful lawsuit against some developers who use public monies to build public housing. I think this was in Dallas, and were disproportionately concentrating that housing in low income and neighborhoods of color. So it was a disparate impact claim. And I think there are ways that municipalities who already track developers' environmental impact, right? So I've been to city permitting so many times, like there's a lot of paperwork that's involved in tracking environmental impact of building homes. What if we also begin to track the social impact of building homes? We know that new homes increase local home values. We know that new homes are at least what I've seen in Houston, and through some separate quantitative analysis, they're disproportionately located in white or increasingly white neighborhoods. And what does that mean for exacerbating the existing inequalities that I reported today? So yeah, absolutely. I think there's some local and regional ways that folks can begin to tackle some of these issues.
Okay. By far the most popular question so far is, how have real estate professionals responded to your research?
That's a great question. I will say I've had a very mixed response. So some of this is related to the fact that if they're inviting me to give a talk, most likely they already know a little bit about what I'm going to say. So maybe they might already be a little bit amenable to listening and hearing the results of my research. But I've reported this research to hundreds and hundreds of real estate professionals across the US over the last few years. And some are very, very almost like relieved to be hearing what I'm saying to them. Like, I knew this was happening. Like, you're basically, what you're doing is you're just like, you're confirming what I thought was going on, but what I didn't know. And many of these real estate professionals have been real estate professionals of color, right? Who, in my book, I talk about how many real estate professionals of color are actually like locked out of white real estate professionals networks. And so they don't ever get a fair shot to do their work. And they know that that's going on, but they don't necessarily have the evidence for it. So that's kind of like one group, like, oh, wow, you're like, we knew this was happening. Thank you so much for shining a light on this. Another group is a group that's completely shocked. Like, oh my goodness, I had no idea. Where can we even start when it comes to this? Like, very much like surprised response. And then the third,
receptive to the idea that it actually is occurring.
Yes, receptive, and also, yes, receptive. I'll say that, receptive. And then the third group, and we've noticed this, I've noticed this especially amongst real estate appraisers, is basically complete like disbelief and rejection of the findings, attempting to say like, you don't know what you're talking about. You don't actually understand appraisals. Let me explain it to you. It's all about real estate demand. And then when I say, well, we actually like considered real estate demand and included that in our statistical models, there are any number of other excuses come to the fore. Like, well, what about crime? And what about school quality and all that? And we come back and say, well, yeah, actually, we thought about all of that. And the fact that that's your go-to response is actually illustrating part of the problem, right? And so we have gotten a lot of pushback amongst appraisers in particular. And I will say that the Freddie Mac report that came out a couple of weeks ago was awful in its findings, unsurprising, at least to me and many others who study this. And it was also really great in that it actually totally validated all of the field work that I've been telling people for years, the quantitative analyses that I've done with Dr. Howell. And so, hopefully that industry in particular can help kind of, round out some of the other research that I and others have been doing for decades.
Why do you think appraisers in particular were so defensive as opposed to other types of real estate professionals?
I think appraisers they've not been in the spotlight regarding this issue for quite some time. So, for example, mortgage bankers and the mortgage lending industry has been under very close scrutiny for some years, right? So like the Dodd-Frank Act in part was passed because of the gross injustice that researchers have been able to uncover in the lead up to and the fallout from the last housing crash we had in 2007, 2008. But that was possible because researchers have had access to Home Mortgage Disclosure Act data, right? And so researchers have been shining a light on that industry for a couple of decades now, and explaining like, this is what's happening, this is what's going on. Real estate agents, real estate brokerage industry, same thing, right? The Department of Housing and Urban Development has been conducting audit studies of real estate agents for decades. And there's been a persistent, if somewhat declining, overt forms of discrimination in the real estate brokerage industry reported in those documents by the Department of Housing and Urban Development. As far as we know, the Freddie Mac report is the first time the federal government has acknowledged that that this might be an issue and actually conducted some internal analyses. They have yet to release the data that they have, the appraisal data that they have, to external researchers. So there has been researchers, even though I and Dr. Howell have tried for years to get access to that data, they would not share it with us. They would not allow us a means of accessing that data. So of course, as I've explained to an appraiser last week, if no one's actually investigating if there's a problem, there's nothing to talk about. But once you start looking into it and digging into the issue, you're going to start seeing what we've been observing in Houston and other places for some time.
I just wanted to point out we have maybe about 10, 12 minutes left. We have about 25 questions lined up. Obviously, we're probably not going to get to all the questions. We will record all the questions and pass them on to Dr. Korver-Glenn, and hopefully she will be able to respond. But we'll do the best we can to get through as many as we can. The next most popular question was, do you think the bank's investment in reducing racism and especially Black housing post-George Floyd will help to reverse these trends, or is this just window dressing?
I mean, it might help a little bit, but it doesn't change it. Those actions don't actually change the criteria and the logic that are underlying evaluative criteria for both mortgage bankers and appraisers, right? So yes, it might be like a short-term help injecting some cash into neighborhoods of color, or specifically, I think you said Black neighborhoods. But it does not actually address what I discuss in my book as the fundamental issue, which is that the logics and the methods and the strategies and the routines of these housing market industries are what have remained virtually unchanged and uncontested. And it's those same routines, rules, policies, criteria that actually are at root the cause of what I saw in my research.
Mm-hmm. One question is whether, how is it if individual buyers of color, how could they even know if they've ever been discriminated against by a mortgage broker or a developer or a real estate agent or an appraiser? And what can they do about it if how do they do anything about it if they don't know?
Exactly.
You mentioned that before.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. And that's part of the problem, is that one of the comments I have gotten from professionals who've given me a little bit of pushback is like, well, why don't they just file a discrimination claim? I'm like, okay, you realize what I had to do to be witness to this? I had to gain access to the private, what sociologists call backstage spaces, the non-public spaces where a lot of this goes down, right? So how would a home buyer of color or a home seller of color or a real estate professional of color know what's happening. That's it. That's the point. They would not know. And yet that doesn't change the reality that it is happening. And so in my book, I discuss that how we define discrimination. It's not just like, it doesn't just require a like overtly racist interaction between like a white person and a person of color. It actually happens behind the scenes, even if there's not a person of color involved, right? And so how do we go about changing that? And that's why changing the logics and methods and incentives and routines is so important, because as I and others have argued, we can't just like go out and change people's minds. We can't just go out and change stereotypes, but we can change policies. We can change routines. And we can do things a different way. And if we do things a different way, then maybe the racist ideas will still be there, but they won't matter as much in how the business gets done.
And that raises another question, which is kind of the next question here, which is, does the media do the media and others have to start naming and shaming here before people change?
Mm-hmm. Maybe. I mean, I know several journalists who've been writing about this, and I know that that some of this being hit, like the Newsday report, the undercover report they did. I think they might have even won a Pulitzer Prize for it. I think it was a 2019 undercover investigative report they did on real estate agents. Garnered a lot of national attention, and it brought to light many of the things that I discussed in my book as well. Likewise, there have been many high-profile outlets, including the New York Times, that have covered instances of appraisal discrimination recently. Again, bringing this to the fore and bringing this to national attention. Most reporting focuses on individuals, though. Most reporting focuses on this as like an individual discrimination issue. And I think one of the things that would need to happen for things to substantively, meaningfully change is for media attention to actually dig a little deeper and go, okay, so we keep seeing these individual instances happening. It's not because there's just like a bunch of bad apples or rotten apples. It's like, this is how things are supposed to go. So how do we change the status quo? And if we got some media attention, sure, that would be great. I also think that that industry and regulatory bodies need to have some serious conversations about what needs to happen to help bring the housing market into alignment with fair housing goals.
How do you think your findings would differ if you were BIPOC yourself, a Black, Indigenous, or a person of color? For example, would your white interlocutors have been as open about the racialized practices? That is one of the things I find so remarkable, is how open they were in their conversations with you. Yeah. And you said at the beginning they trusted you because you were white. Yeah.
I mean, I don't have a comparison case, and I was a graduate student when I collected these data. I didn't have lots of grant money to hire a research assistant to help me. If I had been able to hire a research assistant who was a person of color to be able to help me with the data collection, and we could have compared, that would have been phenomenal. I did not have that. I didn't have money to do that at that time. But I know, based on what other research has shown, that white people are more comfortable and feel safe when they are in the presence of other white people. And so I absolutely think that being white and white identified allowed me to gain access to some of these data. And I guess, I don't know for sure, but I have a pretty confident guess that if I were Asian, Black, Latinx, Indigenous, or another person of color, I probably wouldn't have been witness to some of these same things. Although I will say that I don't know if that's the case about just the logics and routines and rules, right? I think that anybody who spends time investigating and examining how organizational rules and policies are racialized in the contemporary housing market would have been able to gather a lot of that same data. I was able to. Yeah, exactly. I was able to gather some of the very explicitly racist kinds of data that perhaps a person of color would not have been able to, would not have been privy to. I don't like reproducing that explicitly racist kind of data in my talks, so I don't usually highlight very much of that. But I do think that any person who was investigating like the actual racialized routines and policies of the contemporary housing market industry could have gathered a lot of the same data that I did.
Here's one that I'm not sure you'll be able to answer, but
Okay.
I'll throw it out there. The discussion of Lindale has one participant wondering if the NHIP, that's the I-45 expansion project that you're probably familiar with, has increased speculation in I-45. Or what, or you know, basically, has it increased speculation or has it decreased values? I'm just kind of wondering whether it may not be something that you can address.
Yeah, so when I collected these data, I mean, those conversations on I-45 have been going on for, for so long.
Yeah, forever
and ever. When I collected the data for this project, that was not an imminent concern or question for the real estate professionals I was talking to. It actually seemed to be more of a concern amongst the home buyers and sellers and existing homeowners in those areas, which makes sense. But yeah, I can't speak to that question directly because, except to say that when I was conducting the research in 2015, 2016, the housing developers and real estate agents I was interviewing and doing fieldwork with were not concerned or like hype to that conversation.
Okay, time for a couple more questions. We'll have to wrap it up in a couple minutes. Well, here's a question from Yvonne Green. You may be familiar with the Garden Oaks residents' efforts to remove racist restrictions from their deed restrictions. Is it possible to remove the verbiage from those deed restrictions for the purpose? I think that has happened in many, or at least they've been they're no longer operational, right, because of court cases.
Yeah, so racially restrictive covenants and deed restrictions on individual title deeds have end dates. I mean, they can't be enforced anymore.
So even if they're there, they're unenforceable at this point.
Exactly. Yeah, and that's actually been true since 1948. I mean. The Shelley versus Kramer was the big kind of landmark case that made those unenforceable. So yeah, it's super interesting how that language has persisted, because you have a lot of historic homes in Houston and elsewhere, right, that have that language.
Still have that language. Do the behaviors of the parties in your study appear to be motivated primarily by profit, or do their racist practices actually diminish profit, or more broadly, diminish a sustainable and stable and healthy housing market? In other words, are they motivated by profit, but does it actually work against them in the big picture?
Yeah. So, supposedly they're motivated by profit. And I think that on the one hand, that's true. Like what I presented about the appraisal inequality over time, home values in white neighborhoods are substantially higher than home values in otherwise comparable neighborhoods of color. For the same house, you buy the same house, put the same house in two different neighborhoods with the same socioeconomic status, same crime rates, same school quality, all of that, and those houses are going to be dramatically different in their value. So as long as folks are getting paid through percentage-based commission, then they will make more money if they're representing folks in white neighborhoods as opposed to folks in neighborhoods of color. However, that wasn't the only part of the story, right? There's another hand, right? There on one hand, and then we have the other hand. The other hand is that the real estate professionals that I interviewed did not actually use any quantitative metrics to determine profitability in the way that I and my co-author have done. They assumed that they would be able to be more profitable in white areas and working with white clients. And actually, this is like using the principles of game theory. I have like a separate like little side project about this. This is not in the book, but if you have say you have 1,000 real estate agents and 900 of them are all going after the same 50 white home sellers, then you know, a whole lot of real estate agents are not going to get paid at all, right? If they all assume that the white home buyer, the white home seller is the most profitable.
It's almost like the lottery.
Exactly, right. And going with that, it's the presumption that matters as well, right? So white home sellers and home buyers are given the benefit of the doubt, while home buyers and sellers of color are assumed to be not profitable. And this is if we only define profitable as like economically profitable. And the other thing that I want to point out is that at one point in my presentation, I mentioned that the way that the housing market is structured is to maintain a racial economic order, right? It's not just about maximizing economic profitability. It's about maintaining white dominance and economic dominance all together, right? So this is why we have Brad, the white real estate agent and housing developer, who has the opportunity to go on and like represent these Latinx home buyers that he's recently just like exploited them by purchasing their homes for lower than market rate value in the Heights. And he doesn't go on to represent them when they go on to buy their homes in the suburbs. Why is that? It's because he's not just interested in like maximizing his profit. He's also, and not just him, the industries that I discussed more broadly are also about maintaining a racial and economic order as well. So yeah, there's all kinds of assumptions about economic efficiency that get tossed around when we enter into discussions of the housing market. But as I and many others have shown, it's not just a question of economic profitability. Since like the modern housing market is predicated on maintaining a racial and economic order.
Okay, well, I think that's a good place to leave it, Elizabeth. Thanks very much. We have many more questions. We'll capture the questions and send them to you.
Okay.
And then hopefully we will find a way to continue this discussion. So again, thank you to Elizabeth Korver-Glenn, author of Race Brokers, Housing Markets and Segregation in the 21st Century, available for purchase from retailers nationwide. The Kinder Institute Forum, this is our Urban Read series, which features authors. The Kinder Institute Forum features thought leaders. On November 10th, we'll return with Antoine Bryant. He's a planner, community advocate, and former Houstonian, recently appointed Director of Planning and Development for the City of Detroit, the Director of Planning and Development for the City of Detroit. So he'll talk a little bit about what Detroit can learn from Houston. And then on December 1st, parking expert Donald Shute from UCLA, my former professor, will discuss potential parking reforms to make cities more sustainable and equitable. You can register for these upcoming webinars by visiting the kinder.rice.edu website or by scanning the QR code that is on your screen right now in order to visit the website. So again, Elizabeth Korver-Glenn, very stimulating and provocative conversation. Sorry we couldn't get through all the questions. Thanks so much. And good luck in New Mexico. And we look forward to seeing you again in Houston sometime soon. And to the many people, the hundreds who participated, again, thanks for being here and have a good day.